Well, then I'll go forth with France, and we'll include that your question in the later parts. I want to start by saying that I looked at the news today on Al Jazeera, which is to me the best source of news because it isn't totally obsessed with local American politics. And they have really good reporters in every country of Africa and Asia. And they're very, very objective in the sense that they do present both sides of it, and they're not afraid to present radical ideas of both sides. In any case, big three articles, the headline and major pieces that they presented was Hong Kong, where the protests have begun again, and the demonstrators went into the biggest department store or shopping center, and since everybody there has masks on, there was no way to identify them from other people, and they began making speeches and throwing leaflets and so on, and reviving their movement, and there was really no way to stop them. And of course, they want democracy and free speech and everything, and a lot of their people are in jail. So that was the first headline. And then the second headline was Iran, which has had a terrible time already with the coronavirus. And they broke out of the quarantine, and they broke every kind of law to go out again, and their demands are more radical in the sense that they just don't want a shift among mullahs. They are really daring to ask for some real democracy. In France, I get a feeling, and I'll quote from one of the reports that I read, I get online minutes of online meetings of various local groups. So I kind of am aware of what people are planning for this week, because officially in France, tomorrow is the first day of deconfinement. And as everything that has happened here concerning this, there's a lot of uncertainty about it and confusion. But definitely the mood is this. The confinement has been like a, what do you call that? A pressure cooker that has been heating up, and that it's getting ready to blow up and explode with anger. And there are many reasons for this. As you may remember, December 5th was a general strike that was called by the CGT, the main historically communist labor movement. But of course, it was called in words, not so much in deeds, but it was very strong. It was supported by the Yellow Vests convention, in which I participated and fought for a resolution saying that we support this the December 5th movement, when those that had organized it, a faction, had done everything they could to prevent any resolution from coming to the floor and to prevent us from taking any position, which is what sectarians do when they're outnumbered. So the problem was that what we were calling convergence, that is to say, the coming together, the unity between unions, yellow vests, ecological groups, and various other groups that had thrown themselves into this struggle, among them, particularly the people in the emergency room of hospitals and hospital people in general, because of years of cutbacks, and now, and so they were gassed and they were not listened to, and they were doing like, I don't know how you call it, strikes where they're there, but not cooperating and doing things, anything they could. Anyway, the same thing in education, where the teachers, although timid and disorganized, were all of them upset because the government imposed a whole new curriculum. You know, France is like the army. Everything is top down. We'll get to that in a minute. So the government decides what's going to be on the final exam for millions of French kids, and they say what the curriculum is and the way you're supposed to go through, and they introduced basically America reforms that were so complicated, with so little consultation with teachers, that no one could understand them. People were just stunned. But the tendency that was clear was to making school less democratic, more competitive, with better schools and worse schools, although they're all, state schools, and that students had to choose in the first year of high school their career path, and that the number of options that they had in high school was limited. Everything was made more rigid, yet not more simple and clear. Plus,
this happened when?
This was all happening, I'm taking us back to December 5th.
Got it.
Last year, okay? So there was a huge social movement on every level in France. The hospitals, demonstrations every day. The schools, small ones, because it's hard to have a strike in a high school, but pickets outside, something happening every day. There was, for the first 2 weeks, transit strikes. Half the metro was shut down all the time. And many of the TGVs and other national trains were stopped by the Railroad Workers Union, who have for years been the backbone of the organized proletariat. And then there were all these different actions going on in the social area, plus a radicalization of the ecological movement with something called, what is it called, Millennial Rebellion or Youth Revolt? I've forgotten. But different groups doing
Extinction Rebellion.
Extinction Rebellion, thank you. All of this happening, and even on the parliamentary left, some of the groups that have always turned their backs on each other, which led to the election of Macron in the first place, were at least talking about some sort of national coming, popular front. But the big thing was that Macron, who is a maniac in his own way, a well-mannered maniac, not like our raving maniac, but equally a maniac, driving ahead with absolute Chicago school ideology of taking away all government support for anything human and privatizing everything, went right ahead with his reform of retirement. And the French retirement was something that was won at the end of World War II, when the workers were still armed, and when there were, the government was run by a sort of coalition of Gaullists and communists, and they put together a really good retirement system, which has been chipped away by subsequent governments year after year after year. And that's been, 70 years? But it's still the best one that I've ever heard of. So they were completely reforming it on the grounds that there were a few problems with it, which they may or may not have been problems. The main problem was that some people got to retire earlier, like coal miners. Well, they fought for that, and I just saw a documentary of these guys that come out of, all black and they go home and wash and so on. Obvious, they got to retire earlier. And, stuff like that, which, by the way, enters onto our discussion with Sam and Peter Hudis on what's a fair wage and so on. Obviously, each according to his work rather than the number of hours of work is what counts. So anyway, the whole country was absolutely up in arms about that. And so that all these demonstrations were supported. And when Christmas vacation came around, now you have to understand that France is a land where vacation is like God. It's the most important thing. It's what they talk about when they're not talking about food at every single gathering of people. And so the reunions and at the suggestion or invitation of the government said, well, let's take a vacation from this struggle. Of course, the workers understood perfectly well that was just a way to break the solidarity and break the elan of the movement. And so over the heads of their union leaders, they said, fuck that shit. We're still striking. So that's where things stood just on the eve of the virus. The problem as we got into January and February was that the unions, who are a sacred cow here, and whom even the Trotskyists sort of criticized, but not really, were doing their usual thing, which is separate the struggles geographically, separate them by trades, Gomperize them, and stretch them out over the long run, knowing that the government can hold out longer than them. It's perfectly obvious. All they have to do is act tough, and they look better day after day, and they have the police and the army. So the only way to beat them is to pull together and strike hard and fast. So the union tactics are always the opposite. In one area they're on strike, but in another area they're not. They're on strike 2 days a week, or one sector is on strike. And I did my best. I called a meeting in Montpellier, and we had about 30 people, maybe 40, to hear me sound off, as you just heard me, about the unions, and there were wild squeals of traitor by some. But I think a lot of people saw and felt that it's a real problem. All right. Then suddenly comes the coronavirus, which the people on my local here in the country, Yellow Vest group, all suspected was a plot on the part of the government to call off the social movement, which of course they used it for that. Now, what I'd like to do is translate something that was just I saw on YouTube. There's a very famous actor called Vincent, Landon, Vincent Landon.
Ouais, c'est ça.
He's not loved by everyone, but not political. And he made from his confinement a little speech which he read and which has been going all around. And it's very, very eloquent. And I'm just going to paraphrase it a little bit because it sums up the anger and resentment of this situation, of this moment where the confinement is going to be over and everybody is asking the question, what next? So he says, how is it that such a rich country, France, the sixth world economy has been able to break down its hospitals to a point where to prevent the overflow of uh, reanimation services, they had to resort to the solution of the Middle Ages, quarantine the whole fucking country. We who at the beginning, we French at the beginning of the century still could brag about having the world's best health system. And I can testify to that because I've had means of operations, recovered from them all, and never had to pay a nickel. Now, this is what they did. They went back to the system of of the Black Plague, where when you went around to pick up the dead, you had a little perfume here. You see where I can put my handkerchief with perfume into my medieval plague mask. But that, in fact, is what what it is. Now, of course, I lost my glasses. So that's his indignation. And he gives it, he says, but that was then. Since then, the crazy idea that healthcare ought to be profitable because everything today has become a commodity, including the life of humans. The new president, Macron, when he was running, talked about massive investment in the health system. But as soon as he was elected, he went right back to the neoliberal program and refused to pay any attention to all the signs and sirens of alert. 2 months of striking in the emergency rooms. Patients, let them wait. 1,200 heads of services in the hospitals resigned their administrative functions. In other words, they're doctors, they're still there, but they refused to do it. Fine, there'll be less paperwork. Massive presence of doctors and nurses and such in all the big demonstration. We can take care of them. We've got grenades and tear gas. And of course, the same could be said about the other public services. Beyond the healthcare, the whole public services have for decades been undergoing blows from the succeeding presidents, Sarkozy, which was a nasty conservative, and then the fucking socialists, who started out by promising a wealth tax and all the rest of it. And the formula is very simple. One administration after the other, privations for whatever costs money, privatize whatever costs money, education, justice, health, and privatization for anything that makes money, because they've been selling off at bargain prices to their cronies the profitable things. One of the other struggles that was part of the what I was telling you about of the winter was trying to save the Paris airport, which is immensely profitable and works fairly well, from being privatized. So they've privatized now Suez and Alstom, which is the big engineering firm, which they turned over to General Electric. And then Macron came along and is trying to sell the lottery, the state lottery, which was I think invented by Casanova in the 18th century and has always been profitable, and of course the airport. So he's blindly attached to that ideological line. And from the beginning. Uh, uh, he also has a royalist. It's not for nothing that they talk about him as a royalist. He even said that he thought that the French didn't really regretted that they had cut off the king's head. And uh, so he always shows himself in Versailles, which is where he received Putin when Putin came here, and all the big palaces, the Louvre in front of the pyramid. These are the backgrounds. And then he speaks directly to the nation the way de Gaulle and Churchill did. Uh, and he shows total contempt for ordinary people. He makes fun of losers, and he saw his mission of giving money and encouragement to sort of startup nation capitalism leaders and kicking the butt the backward people, that is to say, the working classes who still believed in unemployment insurance and things like that. So he gave big money to the stock market people, and in his first budget, he gave a huge amount. He cut the tax on the big fortunes, which the socialists put through, and as a final move, he cut $5 a month from aid for lodging for poor people. And that is the measure, according to the guy that I'm quoting, of his total out of touchness, and doesn't even have the sense of good public relations. What good is it to take €5 a month away from poor families that can't pay their rent when you're giving billions to the capitalists? He doesn't seem to understand that people are not totally stupid. So then the yellow vest came along. Once again, let's go back in time. The yellow vest broke out at the end of 2018, in the month of November. And for the first beginning part, they had like 70% popularity. Nobody had ever seen anything like it before. Macron pretended they weren't happening and ignored them, and they never came up. Then, after a couple of clashes, he decided that he had neglected them. And he made one of his wonderful, pathetic addresses where he addressed himself to a single mother and said that he was sorry that he had forgotten her or something. In other words, he shows his noblesse oblige, and he actually gave about 10 billion, it says here, but I don't believe it. A good sum of money in any case that he thought would satisfy the yellow vests, and he took away the tax on diesel fuel. That was just a scam because it didn't go to ecology at all. And so he thought that would do the trick. But of course it didn't, because by that time the yellow vests had developed out of a kind of a consumer consciousness to social consciousness. And they were asking for basic democracy, participatory democracy, right of recall for elected officers, and 8 million other things that the government was not willing to talk about. And so they brought out the police in a reign of police brutality that was really, really scary and remarkable, and won them honors from the UN and all the human rights groups that put France on the very top of the list of countries of totally irresponsible and vicious police brutality, which was not only shooting flashballs into people's heads and blinding them and ripping off arms and legs, but also herding them into court with summary trials and sentences that are absolutely unheard of in France. First of all, most sentences in France are suspensive. In other words, you're condemned to a year, but you don't really serve it if you behave yourself. But it goes on your record and it stays there for a while. But all of these sentences were, you go right in and you serve the time, and without full right of defense or anything like that, and huge fines. Typically, I'll give an example, which is a typical one, of a couple that comes up from someplace in the provinces to take part in one of the big Paris demonstrations. And they get arrested. It could be before they even get to the place where it's supposed to gather, because in their backpacks, they've got helmets or gas masks or something, which proves that they are part of a conspiracy to come and riot. Because who would carry a gas mask or a helmet if they weren't planning to attack the police? And since they've got kids at home and jobs on Monday, this is always on a Saturday, they get dragged, they can't go and get bail, come back later and so on, or be held over. Actually, they would be held over so they could go before a Congaree court. And the next thing they know, they've got a $2,000 fine and maybe even a jail sentence. So this is what Macron's answer. First, he tried the carrot, and that was the stick. And then we get up into the point where we were talking about before. From December 5th, 2019, all the different parts of the struggle were converging, albeit with a kind of a lack of tactics and lack of any but moral unity, which I attribute to the union's foot dragging. Suddenly, the virus is on the scene, and the government ignores it. They have no interest in it. They have plenty of advance information, as the US government did, but they don't do anything. And let me turn the page here. And when it finally hits, the hospitals are totally overwhelmed. There's no masks, there's no jelly, there's no tests, there's no respirators, there's no beds, and not enough people in the reanimation department. What do they call that? Where they bring you back to life. That's what it's called? Reanimation? Could you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, Richard, we can hear.
Yes, Dad, we can hear you. We just don't know a better word than that.
Oh, okay, maybe that is the word. I'm sorry. I get stuck between languages. So first they deny that it's happening. Then they say that they have a big meeting, okay? And on 29th of February, under the heading of COVID-19, in which they bring together the two parts of the parliament, and the government announces that it is putting through by ordinance, that is to say, without a vote of parliament, where it was held up by amendments from the left, putting in practice their cut of the pensions. In other words, this pension reform, which was never clear to anyone, which nobody wanted, which unions struck over and everybody else demonstrated over, the first thing they did as a reaction to the coronavirus was say, well, we're just pushing it through, and we're utilizing emergency provisions, of Section 49-3 of the Constitution. And there you go. The next thing that they thought of as March came around is what to do about the elections. Because just like in Wisconsin with the primaries, early March was time for municipal elections where the political parties tested their strengths and so on. And so they wanted to insist, but they broadcast two different broadcasts the same day. One is that everybody should go out and vote, and the other is that nobody should go out for any reason. And that has been pretty much the way that they've been talking. And it's not just a single Trump, but a whole government with spokespeople on every level, because they have only one strategy, which was to lie. First, they said that it was only like a little grip and it would go away. And it wouldn't touch France, because remember that the cloud of atomic debris from Chernobyl went around France miraculously, went through Switzerland and across Belgium, but didn't enter France. And more lies, which is, oh, we've got plenty of masks in stock. And then, but they're not worth anything. We don't really need masks. And then, no, I guess we don't have enough. The masks are coming. Well, when are they coming? Soon. And of course, there are still no masks, and there are still not enough tests, and there's still the whole problem of the hospitals, which have been torn apart. And at this very moment, and I think I'll come to a close from this historical part here, at this very moment, they are still going ahead with planned closing of beds in hospitals. And they are still closing hospitals and clinics in the countryside with this idea of consolidation. So they are clearly prepared not to give in on anything and to go ahead with their neoliberal program. Now, as I see online and look at Facebook pages and pick up stuff from the internet, all the different groups, from the ecologists and the unions and the teachers, and especially the medical people, they're in front. They have a petition out, which everybody is invited to sign, but you sign it either as a sympathizer or a doctor or a nurse or whatever, which is called Off with the Masks, and demands, I could actually read you what their demands are, but they're real sharp, good demands. And everywhere, movements are coming together and talking about coming together. So we'll see what's going to happen starting this week. It's really going to start slowly on the local level. We're sort of just pussyfooting around to see how far we can go in terms of going out with yellow vests in public. But everywhere there's anger, everywhere there's the will to unite, and the government, it seems to me, is completely disgraced by its total lack of efficiency, its total lack of coherence, its constant lying and re-pulling it back, its patronizing of the public, its complete lack of tact. And I'm not sure how much support they have outside of, and here's, along with the police, their strongest suit, the media. I've been subjected to the daily 7 or 8 o'clock news on French TV because Eliane likes to watch it. And I watch it to see how they can manage to hide the news and stay on the air for half an hour. They talk nothing about the international situation. unlike, I'll put in another plug, Al Jazeera. If you haven't tried it, click on Al Jazeera, news every day, updated every hour, on the hour, with real good reporters right on the spot. So, but the French here, it's awful. 9 billionaires own all the media. I'm talking about all the newspapers, all the weekly magazines, and all the TV stations. That's a fact. So the only thing that really stands out in terms of daily media is Mediapart, which I'm sending gift subscriptions to all my friends because it is a little bit expensive. But it is the only place where you can get fairly serious information and keep update. But even they don't compare with Al Jazeera in terms of coverage. It's an online journal. It's mainly analytic, and it has the 2 horrible habits, or 3 horrible habits of French journalism. The articles are much too long. The articles never tell you the pyramid of who, what, why, when, but start in the middle. And thirdly, they don't identify the names of people or the organizations like the BMZ. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? So it's hard to read, and it's very Franco-French, but it's the only horse in town. And aside from that, the media doesn't point out, even as our puny media do, the lies and contradictions of Trump. They do mention that he does sometimes say things, and then the opposite, things that aren't true. But here, I haven't seen much of that. Thank you for listening to this. I hope it was useful.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Dad. And just quickly about, I was just had a friend's birthday party on Zoom last night. A few of them are from the Midwest, and they were just, we were talking about how the rural hospital system has been completely dismantled in the United States. And there are places where people are, several hundred miles from a hospital. And, without any glee, coronavirus is going to come to those communities, and they're not going to have any help. And that's has the potential to change the conversation or the experience for those folks who are in those states who are protesting with semi-automatic weapons to go get a haircut. End.
Now, I have a question, Richard, because my thinking has been that as the bourgeoisie wants to open up its economy again, it's going to take into account, a gradual salami tactic kind of thing to prevent revolutions from happening. Now, what's happening on France along those lines?
Oh, I muted myself out. I think I talked too long already, and we need to leave time for your report on the epidemiological part of it.
Don't dodge the question.
Or refine it, repeat it.
Look,
It's hard to hear you, Sam.
is it?
Sam, I can barely hear you.
Okay, I must not, my headphones must not be working well. Can you
The
hear
question.
me now?
Yes. What is
Okay.
the question about France?
Opening up means lots of different things. Are they doing strategies and tactics to minimize the rebellion?
The government has done everything. And we'll see what's going to happen when we go back down in the streets, but we don't know. We're going to feel that out. But what I'm saying is that the people are angry and they're ready to move, and everybody's talking about it. Off with the mask, everyone together.
but they're not just opening up piece by piece then.
Well, the first thing they did was the stupidest, and one that proves how exactly business oriented they are. They're opening tomorrow the little baby schools, the creches and the elementary schools for the little kids. Now, they closed them first because that was supposed to be to protect the most vulnerable. But now they're opening them for the simple and obvious reasons that they want the parents to go back to work. And they can't go back to work unless they can shove the kids someplace. So the teachers are at risk, everybody's at risk, and it's just typical of Macron's arrogance and their total disregard for public health and their total devotion to increasing profits. Lola, I see you for the first time. Bonjour.
Dad, to clarify, off with the masks, is that metaphoric, like stop lying and stop your fakery?
Yes.
Or do they really? Okay, thank you. Just confirming.
Well, it's my translation, which I knew wouldn't work. It's Bali mask in French.
Down with?
Yeah. But come out and tell the truth.
No, it's take down your mask. The translation would be take down your mask. Show you real face.
Right.
Merci.
So,
Sam, would you like to go ahead? And
I can try. I mean, if I'm not being heard, it's going to be difficult.
no, you're heard.
Okay.
You're heard, but it's very, very quiet.
Okay. I don't know why.
Your microphone needs amplification, Sam.
Can you hear me? No.
That's worse.
Okay, so the microphone must be on, but it must not be working well. I've been having trouble with that for the last, and it's at full volume.
Project.
I'm trying. Oh, does that help?
works.
That
Yeah.
was
Okay.
perfect.
It had gotten moved too far from my mouth. It's really hard to know what's going on. I mean, because the media in the US, and when I've looked at Al Jazeera, it's not much better, are not doing a good job of covering the epidemiologic news. That is, occasionally there's an article about what a country has done and what's happening with its figures. So you hear things like New Zealand's done a good job, and the figures seem to back it up. You hear things about Britain is now rushing to the head of all the bad statistics along with Belgium and the United States and things like that. But it's not scattered, it's pretty scattered. None of the researchers have yet done a good job of putting it together into a picture. And now, in the US, they're doing the most discoordinated, insane job of opening up you can imagine, of course, breaking it down by state and this, that, and the other. Everybody is claiming giant debts. The hospital attached to the medical school that I'm in is just, frozen everything other than coronavirus almost, partly because they have no choice because they had no room and they had no, and everyone's being called a hero. And all the corporate pronouncements, every day they've got one by the CEO or some equivalent, and it's corporate speech. I don't know the extent to which the people who are on the front lines are reading that shit. It is, and the governments of the states are simply going into the red, and they're talking about who to lay off. Now the problem is, at least in some of the states, they have no conception of how to open up, yet they're doing it anyway. So my assumption is that the numbers are going to get very bad and lots of people are going to die. They haven't got enough tests almost anywhere, even to meet their own criteria for what's needed. They've moved the contact tracing out of the governmental public health system into the health and hospital corporations, which is not officially a government body, which I assume means they can pay them less and have less, you know, maybe even they can't unionize. The basic epidemiologic parameters are totally up in the air. And I say I'm going to be taking part in a meeting, I think later this week, maybe next week, in which a bunch of scientists from different disciplines will be talking. And I'm going to try to get some sense of what's known that I don't know yet. But basically, we don't know anything about immunity. We know people do generate antibody, which is good news, but we don't know how protective it is and for how long. People work by analogy with other coronaviruses, but we have no reason to be sure that that's could be better, it could be worse. And there's some talk, chiefly on the left, but not entirely. Gets into the media sometimes, at least, the liberal media, on the socioeconomic forces that breed pandemics. People don't really talk about capitalism as such, but they talk about the growth and how it's leading to all sorts of different risks. The right wing is obviously trying to use this to organize fascist troops through these demonstrations. In some areas, the nurses and similar people have organized demonstrations against that shit with some success. But, no one knows the epidemiologic impact of a demonstration. I'm hoping a lot of fascists get sick and die. And in general, when it's the nurses go out, they keep their distance and keep their masks on. But, even that, we don't know how successful it's going to be at keeping people from getting sick. And we probably never will know. I keep hearing good news about the people in the White House getting exposed, so the chicken shits there may start taking things seriously. But they don't know what to do in any case. I mean, I keep being reminded in the US and France and some other countries about the first couple chapters of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, where he talks about, the incompetence of the king and royal court in France before the revolution, and of the Tsar and Tsarina and Rasputin and stuff in Russia. And, it's the same thing. Now, I can't predict, no one can predict what's going to be the epidemiologic pathway. All the sane predictions are that it's going to be repetitive and in waves at best. I don't know how that's going to affect the politics. Everyone here knows as well as I do. If France suddenly has a real revolution, that changes the story everywhere. But if France does have a real revolution, I tell you, the first order of business better be to get the epidemic under control in a humane fashion. Because I have speculated with this group before about the effects of the flu epidemic of basically at the end of the World War on the revolutionary wave at that time. And it can happen to us too. Because once you're in control, you're responsible, which is what, Macron and Trump may be finding out to their sorrow in the near future. And the only other thing I just want to raise is not epidemiology at all, but well, there's one epidemiologic thing people should be aware of. If we have movements and they're defeated, that's going to have epidemiologic consequences in other ways, like big drug epidemics, HIV, and all that kind of stuff is likely to come back, as well as coronavirus. Now, the other thing I want to say is high politics of the left-wing sort. Because, I was reading Kevin Anderson's nice little piece in the International Marxist Humanist Organization about how Lenin, during the early part of the World War, rethought Marxism and basically was able to figure out a good, effective Marxist response. But on the other hand, what Kevin leaves out is that they had an organization and they had media, and we don't. And we have to start thinking more seriously than the International Marxist Humanists do about what kind of organization we need on the left. And, the movement of movements kind of stuff that you hear in all your local groups is not incorrect, but it is inadequate for a revolutionary situation. Because the movement of movements has no idea about what to do once you do the first negation and drive them out of governmental power. And they bring back, the government of national unity kind of shit, which is always right wing to the extent it can be. And how do you essentially make workers' power real? And the various Trotskyists and post-Trotskyist movements haven't found the solution to that, though they have one piece, which is you do need revolutionary parties. And the Marxist humanists talk about groups like us who are always around, but who never actually managed to win the workers to that struggle. So, we've got to do some very creative thought along those lines, it seems to me. Anyway, that's what I've got to say.
Sam, I'd like to ask you some more specific questions. In France, in the movement of yellow vests, there is huge controversy.
You're breaking up.
Wait a second. I'll move this back where it was before. A lot of time is wasted here in France on the left in discussing things that we can't know about. For example, the claims of this doctor Rouault in Marseille about chloroquine and some people saying that the epidemic isn't really that big. My own feeling is this. Can you, I would say that the chances of it spreading all over Latin America, with Brazil being already overwhelmed and its government doing nothing, and then Africa, and then all the places in Southeast Asia like India, where there's poverty, and again, all of these authoritarian governments, which are also, as you point out, inefficient and unable to and unwilling to come to the aid of people. So I see this as a long-term thing. And looking at other epidemics in history, not only will it keep spreading until it hasn't, there's no place else for it to spread, it's likely to come back in another form, mutate, or at least a second wave, since it's not clear that herd immunity is going to take place in places like Africa. So what I'd like to hear is, I know you have no direct answers, but what are the likelihoods of these things?
Okay, I
So
can
first
talk
of
to
all,
that.
on the question of the cure,
Okay, I'll talk to that. It is clear by now that the malaria drugs don't do it. There is a possibility that if administered very early in the infection, they may do something before the virus gets into your lower part of, basically into your lungs. As long as it's up here, it may be able to do it. I have colleagues who are part of a experiment on that, and we should start having some data and some results fairly soon. There is some evidence that one of the HIV, I think it's HIV, it might be Hep C, antivirals has a little bit of effect in cutting down the time you're in the hospital. It's called remdesivir. They're testing all sorts of things. They may yet pull something out of a hat. And, let's all hope so in a sense. The vaccine stuff is different from the HIV vaccine fiasco for 2 reasons, maybe 3 reasons. First of all, you're able to do experiments really quickly because there's so much spread of the virus. So you don't have to take years. So once they have a vaccine, and there's some of them are already going into test, you'll get results back within a few months. The chances are overwhelming. They're not going to be very effective, at least at first. But if they're well developed, they'll learn stuff from it that may help them develop new vaccines. However, once again, and maybe there is no vaccine. Third, another difference is this virus seems to mutate more slowly than viruses like HIV or Hep C. That's good news. On the other hand, there's some evidence that it may have mutated already in ways that make it worse in Europe and America than it was in China. So, we don't know about that, but there's, I wouldn't go to the bank on that. And we don't know exactly what changed direction of mutation. Now, the waves thing, all the evidence I know suggests to me that people who are hoping there's seasonality to this epidemic are mistaken. There's not going to be much. On the other hand, the lockdowns do create a decline in the active infectivity, the number of people with actively infective virus in a geographic area. To the extent to which when people open up, they keep distance and use masks, it'll be slower to come back. To the extent to which they do rational, large-scale testing and contact tracing, they can hold the spread down. They're not doing that good a job on any of that in most places in the US. I'm told they're doing a reasonable job on it in places like New Zealand. And even I saw something today, maybe even in Germany. That means there will be waves without, simply from that dynamic. Some places there may not be waves. Some places it may just get horrible and stay horrible. So other people in the chat are saying they want to make comments on trends. Brian does, for example. And David wants to talk about nutrition and prevention. The one thing I want to say before David says anything on that is that antibody response is specific and not general. The cytokine storm is effective in a sense. The antibody response is being too effective, but it's overwhelming the body and kills you. So that, when you talk about nutrition and stuff, there's some evidence vitamin D is a good thing. This is not, however, something I'm an expert on. So let me let other people talk and mute myself.
I thought that was too much for you to do.
I only filled it up to here. Thank you.
I think
I cleaned
Sam,
my closet. I can't wait to show you.
I think Sam Fastbinder had
Yeah.
hand up first.
Yeah, okay, let's see. Okay, now I'm on screen, I hope.
Yeah.
All right. One of the points that's been brought up in the histories of neoliberalism, in especially Philip Murawski, never let a serious crisis go to waste, is that the neoliberals have managed to insinuate themselves into policy discussions so thoroughly that nobody can really imagine a way in which the world could be otherwise anymore. That anyone who wants to come up with an alternative to neoliberalism that would be able to empower itself to make policy decisions is stuck at the level of foundations at this point. And so what you have is infinite power combined with infinite stupidity, okay, for lack of a better word. And when climate change started to achieve some sort of consciousness as an existential threat to civilization, the neoliberals have a series of solutions, quote unquote solutions, put that in scare quotes, all of them stupid and all of them basically progressively worse. Okay. We can't be terribly surprised if this is the same way they're dealing with the coronavirus. Step one, ignore the whole thing, open up society again and say, well, everything's fine, or at least, hey, this is all we can really do, And that's kind of what the stage we're at now, okay? When they scrap this and move on to the next stupid thing, the next malfeasance of government power to make things worse, I don't know. I mean, I suppose the death toll could get high enough so that they could be forced to pay attention to it. The problem here, of course, is that in the long run, we are really going to have to focus from a foundational level on what an alternative to neoliberal rule might possibly look like. Okay, that's our task.
I think I was next. Yeah, I agree with that. We need to shift toward thinking ahead, and it's hard to do that, in the middle of the crisis. As I said earlier, some of the more radical mutual aid circles were saying early on that we need to think about the failure of the state, dual power strategies as an alternative, thinking for the long term. But when people are in crisis mode, it's hard to make time for that. I really agree with everything Sam Friedman said. The two sources that I've gotten a lot of information from are, one, the New York Times has been publishing really interesting data on a daily basis, breaking down state by state trends, some of the international trends, looking at the epidemiology. I've found it very useful to peruse that. And another source is the magazine Nature, which is maybe the most trusted scientific journal in the world, has taken down the paywall for a lot of their news coverage in terms of what's happening inside the scientific community in various areas of research, both around around the epidemiology, around the search for vaccine and other remedies, etc. A couple of things that I'll point out, especially from the charts the Times has been posting. One, it's very clear that in most of the US, the daily caseload is steadily increasing. They did a thing the other day where they said, what do the trends look like if you take out the major cities like New York? And it turns out that the curve in the US, which on a national basis looks like a plateau, if you take out New York, where the cases are finally starting to decline, and a few other major cities where the cases are finally starting to decline, the rate of new cases in the US is steadily increasing. And that's true in all of the places in the Midwest and the South that are roughly to reopen. So the prognosis in those places looks very bad. Jenny, we're getting an incredible amount of background noise from your phone that's making
Oh
it
no,
very hard.
I'm so sorry. I thought I was muted.
No. Thank you. Hope you're doing well down there in the epicenter. So that's kind of the national picture. The other thing that came out just yesterday or the day before is they did a piece on scenarios. And the three scenarios that they looked at that apparently epidemiologists are really focusing on now are, one, the case of a very large new wave next year. And that, of course, is what happened with the so-called Spanish flu 100 years ago, where the second year was much worse than the first year. Another scenario is of kind of a periodic trend of up and down waves pretty much ongoing. And then the third scenario, which is the more optimistic one, is periodic waves where each one is steadily lower than the past. But that relies on a certain amount of herd immunity happening, and the threshold for herd immunity is apparently between 55 and 60% of the population having been infected for a virus of this type. And again, as Sam said, that depends on a lot of extrapolation from past trends that we don't have enough data to know if they apply or not. So those are the scenarios that they're looking at, and the prognosis for the next month or two in the US is pretty horrifying, as well as in places like Brazil, where at least the news is starting to come out, which means they're doing more testing than a lot of places.
Yeah, let me jump in with two quickies. One is there was also an article today, I think it was, about in Mexico, where the death toll is much worse than the government is talking about. I mean, just, or, you know, vastly more. And that's going to become a political issue, obviously. The other is a quickie about the one where it decreases in waves. A partially effective vaccine would make that better. So that, you know, I know people sometimes talk about, hey, a 50% effective vaccine why take it? And the answer is, the technical term is it decreases R naught, but what it means is the
infectivity rate.
The rate of infectivity, the average number of people that each person infects is decreased. And that has an enormous potential impact. So I'll mute myself again. Sorry about that, David.
Oh, no problem. It's very informative. Thanks for everyone's insights. I'm really happy I got on. By the way, I'm a doctor, but I have no patients. My patients are rocks and the biogeochemical cycle. So,
are you spelling patience EIENCE?
You could take it any way you want, but I just, from my very naive readings of some of the nutritional literature on this, first, vitamin C apparently was being used in China in hospitals, in New York City hospitals. It seemed, from what I've read, it seemed to have some positive benefits, especially in severe cases. Now, I up my dose from 2 grams a day to 6, so 3 in the morning and 3 at night. And I've been on a 2-gram dose for quite a few years, 2 grams a day, and I very rarely even got a cold, but that's just anecdotal, you know. Far as and Sam mentioned vitamin D. I just got a PDF of a very recent article by some researchers in Northwestern University, which argue that vitamin D deficiency is linked to more severe cases and death. And so they go into what you said, Sam, about this storm, cytokine storm, and how vitamin D is implicated there. And I'll share that, on our listserv for people who are interested. And that's all I have to say about the nutrition. Of course, we listen to Bill Maher. He's been doing his show Friday nights from his home now. And he has this fake audience that laughs at his jokes, But he's a big proponent of eating right and your nutrition being protective, and I think there's some validity there. I mean, when we see that people with chronic diseases, older people like myself are more likely to get severe cases and die. Obesity being apparently a risk factor, and diabetes and so on. And that really leads into what I want to say about DC, because now there are like about 300 deaths in DC. I'm sorry, I can't. I don't know off the top of my head the rate, regarding who's infected, so on. But 80% of those deaths are Black folk. 80%, and they're a little under half the percentage of the population in DC now. We're no longer Chocolate City, we're more like Mocha, okay? And there's been a shift from gentrification and people, millennials particularly moving in and so on. So there's been a demographic shift. So I've been involved in being, doing the kind of research that I've long done on taxes and budget. I've been a long-term member of the Fair Budget Coalition in DC and the DC State Green Party. And I've just put out, and I will share this too, and I would appreciate critical, comments on what I put out, always. I put out a a kind of, actually it's on YouTube, and I put out a presentation on the budget shortfall that DC faces and how we should meet it. And you see, the precedent in DC is that a little over 20 years ago, we had a financial dictatorship in DC, the Control Board, which imposed neoliberal policies, including privatization, all the neoliberal policies we're familiar with. And it led to widening of the racial and economic disparities in DC. So I think what I'm about to say is maybe has some value in terms of the discourse about recovery in a left direction, right? And regarding talk about a green stimulus, a Green New Deal, being an opportunity to push as an alternative to a return to neoliberalism, or even a more coercive form of neoliberalism that we're being warned about. For instance, Naomi Klein just wrote an article about, the surveillance state being put into even greater, greater.
Really important article on The Intercept just this weekend.
Yes. That's what I'm referring to. I didn't even get to read it yet. I just.
Oh, it's frightening, but it's very accurate, I think.
So I'm going to conclude. I just want to say that we do have an opportunity to, in the U.S., to put out a progressive approach in terms of revenue, getting more revenue because of the Trump tax cuts, which mainly went to the very wealthy. And then on top of that, the CARES Act is giving even more tax cuts to the millionaire class and billionaire class. And I think this is an opportunity to put out very progressive tax proposals. And we're getting some real resonance with that and support with those kind of proposals. And secondly, and I'll conclude with this, that the only state in the U.S. that has a public bank is North Dakota. And that comes from the early 20th century struggles of farmers, And that's a model now that's being taken up all over the U.S. For public banking, and how that could be a mechanism. It's specifically the housing crisis, and actually helping the development of social housing. We have a great candidate in D.C., Will Merrifield, who's really pushing that vision of social housing, and I think it could really be taking off around the United States. So anyway, I won't say any more. Be well and stay well, comrades.
Before we separate, hello? Does someone else want to talk?
I was going to say,
I
here in Vermont, we had a Green New Deal proposal that was starting to gain some real traction in the legislature before things fell apart. And it was specifically tied to recapturing a percentage, I think it was 35% of what people gained from the Trump tax cuts. So it was only the wealthiest sector of the population, and it was a percentage of what they were already saving. And it was starting to catch on when things fell apart.
Well, I can imagine in DC, they might be able to pass some good stuff like that. And then the US Congress will nullify it with the support of a good part of the Democratic Party. Unfortunately. I mean, I grew up in DC.
I'd just like to say one thing. I didn't want to let, Sam, your last remarks go unheard. On one point, you said, I think perhaps carelessly, if revolution breaks out in France. Well, a pre-revolutionary situation might break out in France, but I think that the only real revolution has to be, as I'm sure you agree, an international revolution. And France could very well give a signal that might be picked up, just as Hong Kong and Iran are, and then we might see simultaneous things happening around the world, which leads us to the organizational question. The problem with parties, of course, is that every time one has come to power, it has simply turned into its own opposite and become an oppressive power. On the other hand,
That's only happened once.
on the other hand, Soviets, no, that's not true. Soviets, mass assemblies, there are other forms that we are struggling to perfect, and that they would play a role. Stephanie, I'm glad that you are once again visible, because before we break up, I'd like to hear from you. Could you say a few words?
Yeah, why not? So I am here in Newark, New Jersey, so close to New York. And I have still, been following the situation in France as you have. And actually, as you were speaking, I shared, a couple of information also that developed from what you were saying. What I found interesting, it was actually sent, this morning by my sister, who is in France and works in an hospital. And she was sharing, this new song, and there's a music video. So I hope it's going to circulate a lot, because I think it makes a lot of sense with connecting what has happened with the movement of the Yellow Vest and the various protests, and also what's happening now, because it's also including, a lot of slogans that were used during protests by also, health professionals when they were demonstrating before all this started, and then everybody has been put in state of emergency. So I'm also, going to look carefully at what is happening on Monday, because of, opening up and who, is going to be able to resume activity, and who would want also as well, what I don't think this was mentioned, in relationship with what you were speaking about, and you're totally right. The idea is to send back the kids to school in order for the parents to then be available to go back to work, even if we don't know what the conditions are going to be. But then the choice has been left to families to actually, which also doesn't really make sense, but the choice has been left to families to decide if they want to send their kids or not. Everybody I know around me who has kids and lives in France is not going to send back their kids. They just think it's too dangerous. They're going to find other ways, but they just think it's too dangerous also for the kids. And now there is, Kawasaki syndrome, and we don't know very little about what is happening. So everybody is really, uncomfortable with this. And maybe another point I want to make, which, goes with the notion of the fact that, there's a penury of masks, and there is not enough available for everyone. And also this goes for France. And so, Richard, you probably have seen, the switch in discourse in saying that, I think it was maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, Macron was making a speech and said that, every French citizen would be given a mask. And now this discourse has shifted towards everybody is going to be able to buy masks. So still last week, there were not enough masks, even for people who wanted to buy them. And then in relationship with, the cost of a single mask, it used to be 8 cents, and the cost of a mask now is going to be below €1. So, I mean, it's just totally alarming, and thinking, of course, that, some people won't be able to afford this. And also the police, there are some image circulating. The police has been intervening in stopping free distributions of masks, because people have started organizing and making masks in fabric. and the police is just, you know, intervening to stop those free distributions of masks. It was one of them in the 18 arrondissement, which is quite a popular neighborhood, and not everybody is going to be able to buy some. So, so yeah, you know, quite alarmed and still, you know, trying to follow the situation on both sides, and you know, let's see. But I agree with you. I think, you know, people are fed up in France. I also feel that, you know, this entire time, the pressure is just starting, I mean, continued, you know, boiling, and I don't know what is going to happen. But then I think the, you know, the social movement that were active previously, or the reawakening of some of the union and the yellow vests, I think they are still there, you know. So I don't know what form the protest is going to take, but I don't think it's over, and I hope it's not, you know.
Thank you. I heard that, so that video that you described is wonderful. It's quite long,
Yeah.
and it's made up of slogans. And what you see on the screen is a marcher or somebody holding up a sign or something written on the wall. And the slogans are just absolutely wonderful. And then the singer sings them right in, so that you read them as you see. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, you know, the only issue, I guess, and always, it's who reads French and who has access to the language in order to get also the full meaning of this. But yeah, I agree with you. And then there's this message at the beginning saying that, you know, those, those are the message of the people, you know, that it's just a communication, and it's a collection of a lot of slogan. And I put the, you know, reference also on the chat. It's you know, people who organized around the Gilets jaunes, and they call themselves plein le dos, you know, to have a lot on your back, like to carry a lot on your back. And what they started doing, and they have a very interesting website, they documented all the yellow vest demonstration, and they photographed the back of the yellow vest with all the slogan, and they organized this actually according to the, you know, the chapter numbers of the demonstration. So because they were, you know, weekly demonstration for almost a year and a half, 2 years, and there are a lot of material that are accessible there. So again, you know, barrier of language eventually, but I'm really glad that there is more use made of, you know, this kind of voice, because it's really important, and it's so true, you know, with what the situation is still today.
One last point, what Macron did around the opening of the schools for the little kids was one more proof, not only of his cruelty and indifference, but also of the incoherence, because when people were upset about that, then he said, well, the parents could choose not to do it. And then he kicked the ball down on the local officials, could say something about anything to avoid responsibility, except that the class issue comes up because people that are well off can afford to keep their kids home.
Yeah.
But it puts the working people, the so-called essential people that he's been praising as heroes and heroines, having inundated them with gases and flashballs just 2 months earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're the heroes, except that they are in a terrible dilemma. If they don't go to work, they can't feed their families. If they do go to work, they're putting themselves and their families.
And of course, there's going to be a anti-feminist side to that in terms of tendencies to want people to go back to the one worker family.
Well, for now, many of the slogans on that song that Stephanie was talking about were feminist slogans. And women have been in France really at the forefront of this, particularly in the yellow vests. Don't ever forget that the women were on the barricades in 1871 on the Commune and everything.
Absolutely, and this is one of the things Macron would probably like to reverse.
Well,
and there may be a tendency in this which has to be fought, right? If you don't see the threat, you don't fight it.
Well, Lola here has been working for over a year on the participation of women and the things in ideology, in neoliberal ideology, that keeps them from perhaps participating in social movements. Would you say something about that, Lola?
Yeah, we just published an article in Social Psychology that tested the hypothesis that people who endorse neoliberal ideology to a greater extent, they are less willing to engage in such movements like the Yellow Vest movement, because they rationalize inequalities to a greater extent, and also because they don't believe in collective movements, as they believe that everyone should like act for themselves and just do what's best for themselves. And I just also shared a video, a YouTube video. I think Richard, you're gonna like it. It's also a song about the virus and collective movements, and it goes also in the same direction as what you both said about France, and that people are I think really fed up, and that they are angry. And I think that protests are gonna come back. And I just read an article that said that the secret services, let's say, they are worried about an uprising at the end of the deconfinement, because there are many messages on the social media that are both on the right side and on the left side talking about protests and marches right after the confinement, the deconfinement. So let's see what's going to happen.
Wow.
And they're going to be ready for it.
Yeah.
Well, we've already got our masks. Should we leave it right there for now today?
Yes.
And how do you feel about keeping up the rhythm of every couple of weeks?
That's good.
Good.
Let's do it. Okay, well, Fred will send out, and everybody can send out what you like as the subjects you want to talk about, and we'll get together in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Thank you. So happy to see so many of you today, and it's really been very fine for me. Thank you.
Good to see and hear everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, good to see everybody.
Wonderful.
Stay safe and healthy. Call your mother.
Bye.
Bye.
Leave.
How do you leave? How do you get out of here? Fire in a crowded meeting.